So this is to bring you to some of the particular work that I have done. I really did focus on the Global Fund, the Gavi Alliance, and to a certain degree PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and also to some extent the World Bank multi-country AIDS program. This was done with a colleague of mine, Bruen, at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland as part of this INCO consortium that Annie described. What I'm going to try and do here is recognise the political perspective that has been in this assembly already in terms of the rise of civil society in response to the structural adjustment programmes, the gaps that were left there, and the effective breakdown of state services. But I want to add another dimension to this, an organisational perspective, and to really focus on this multi-level governance issues, and this within the context of global policy networks, because that's often what we see at play in terms of the design of policies and also later their implementation. I'm going to focus on some conceptual issues. I'll ground it in the example of the Global Fund and then move back to those conceptual issues again. So first off, it's worth me stating how I'm actually viewing these global health initiatives for this purpose, and looking at them as global coordinating and multi-level governance mechanisms. The policies that they decide on, the agendas that are set, the priorities that are there, and then how they are implemented are done by networks and partnerships involving public actors from different decisional levels. Sometimes you will have people who don't really have an awful lot of power in terms of what they can say and commit to, and other times you will have delegates who are there who can often override the policy of their own government. It also includes non-public actors of a very, very diverse nature. NGOs were deeply involved in the establishment of a lot of these organisations, but to varying degrees. The Global Fund is probably the one in which they had most engagement. First from advocacy, from consultancy in the development and the design of what the Global Fund is going to look like and its policies, and then also direct involvement in negotiations in the Global Fund Transitional Working Group. There were certain NGO leaders that were involved in this process, and I put leaders in inverted commas because the question is, how did those leaders become involved? Primarily, it was their direct connection to people, and they were called on based on trust and also based on the influence that they had. The Gavi Alliance had a limited small network of NGOs, and this really was led by one particular organisation, the Programme for Appropriate Technology in Health, based in Seattle, and some people may call them a bingo, business interest NGO, but they are actually broader than that. And in terms of PEPFAR, it was limited to lobbying and limited consultations, again, with NGO leaders selected by the people who designed PEPFAR, again, a very small group within the administration. So as I said, I'm going to focus on the Global Fund. The diagram here is just to give you a sense of the structure of the Global Fund, and I'll mention some of the points of entry in there as well for NGOs. There are multiple points of entry, both to influence policies, the priorities, but also the governance. They include the board delegations, 3 of which have been assigned to NGOs, the Northern NGO delegation, the Southern NGO delegation, and the NGOs representing affected communities delegation. Each of these delegations have communication focal points which connect outwards to other groups and to other networks. The partnership forum is another point in which people can be engaged, as within countries, to the country coordinating mechanisms as principal recipients and the networks that are involved in each of those. What we see happening then is that decisions are taken from different constituencies in a process involving many, many people. It's characterised by deliberation, by bargaining, and by compromise seeking, sometimes not actually getting what you wanted. Ultimately then, responsibility becomes dispersed across a large number of the people who are involved there. And I'll touch on some of these points as we go through this. Some of the gains that NGOs had throughout the first 10 years or so included an increased influence across different sections of the Global Fund structure itself. In 2004, the delegation representing affected communities got voting rights, and that was quite a significant change, creating a third voting bloc within the board of the Global Fund. People from civil society themselves were appointed to key roles within the Secretariat, so had operational influence internally within the fund. There was an increased influence over policy. This included an expansion of their consultancy processes directed to affected communities. One of the key examples of this is what was called the Community Systems Strengthening Framework, which, if you see the document, that was done through a very extensive consultation on a very low budget. And when it was adopted by the board of the Global Fund, about 90% of it are the words that the community's delegation were able to gather by using their quite wide networks of people. They also gave legitimacy, which was enhanced with these other communities. They exchanged a lot of information between the different delegations. They gave a lot of support to the different delegations and to one another, as well as sometimes supporting the bilateral donors themselves who didn't have access to some of the information. NGOs had very transparent procedures within their delegations for electing people within the delegation and also for electing them as part of the board. And they were very well informed when they came to board meetings. And that was one of the continual compliments that was being given in the course of this research. There was also increasing cooperation at global level, creating conditions for a greater coordination of resources across global health initiatives. People who were at one point involved with the Global Fund and are now involved with the Gavi Alliance are sharing resources and information with one another. And some of this cooperation was facilitated by a reduction of warring factions, particularly among the large international NGOs. And a lot of this was done within, or by the activities of the International Civil Society Support Organisation. But challenges were there as well. And some of these challenges I've listed here. The first being, despite a lot of the clarity within the delegations, people who are not necessarily connected to that were saying that there are undemocratic and anti-participatory processes between global and country levels. One example was given of, you have all of these people flying globally to meeting, to meeting, to meeting, and they're never connected to the communities that they claim to represent. There was also a growing division between a lot of the global activities and what people felt in the country realities. But coupled with this were some very practical things. Slow release of information from the Secretariat, but also slow release of information from the delegations themselves. And the lengthy chain of delegation between all of the different groups meant that a lot of the decisions were very invisible. Divisions and rivalries were there between NGOs and among broader civil society groups as well, many of whom felt their position was never being taken seriously within the discussions around the formation and then later evolution of the fund. But NGOs themselves were concerned with donor co-option. They felt, and it was reported, that they were concerned about issues of diverting their activities for the sake of attracting funding, that technical management that was quite resource heavy and time heavy was taking over from longer term human rights and social justice issues. And one of the things that came up a few times was poachers turned gamekeepers. People who at one point and for many years were part of civil society, now being part of the Global Fund, have they started to try and manage us and using what often are termed network leveraging. Ultimately though, what we see here is that NGOs themselves are becoming increasingly part of the power structures, yet there are poor accountability mechanisms in place. This quote here is from one of the people that was interviewed, really comes down to the core of this: to whom, for what, and how. And the person said, what is important is to be aware that they are not observers standing on the sidelines with a watchdog function, figuring out what's right to do. They are also similarly interested in finance from the Global Fund. That is often overlooked, I think, and the civil society role as advocates and watchdogs and drivers of fairness needs to be looked at very carefully. Bringing this then back to the conceptual level. The Global Fund is a prime example of a multi-level governance structure. And we need to look at this type of a structure when we want to consider some of the issues of accountability. Some of these factors include looking at the internal accountability mechanisms within these structures. They perform very specific control functions. There's grant oversight, the reporting and audits, and the investigations of, for example, in the Global Fund, the Office of the Inspector General, or similar policing mechanisms that other initiatives have, which is keeping an eye on the financing results. NGOs themselves are formally accountable to the limited constituencies that they have, to members and to their rank and file, to donors, and to the authorities in the countries where they are registered. One of the other types of accountability that takes place is this informal or peer accountability. I mentioned the delegation systems where you have large groups of people who are effectively observing one another. And there's an informal monitoring of their own performance within these networks. They report on different activities, and it relies on naming and shaming and where an issue comes up, the threat of withholding resources or the action of withholding resources or even restricting access can work as a sanction. But ultimately, these types of accountability mechanisms lack any transparency. Ultimately here is this issue of responsibility, and it's diluted among a large number of actors, and it allows for blame shift games and for sanctioning problems when they can be done. Is it the donors that make this decision? Is it an NGO? Is it the multilaterals? And there's a lot of blaming that goes on for things that are not right. Outside of this, which I mentioned already, are external accountability mechanisms, voluntary codes of practice, which are really light and soft, but they're not institutionalized, they're weakly codified, and they're dependent on moral commitments and social pressures to be able to stick with them. This is the last slide here. The other area that I said that we need to look at, as well as multi-level structures, is also that a lot of these decisions are being made and influenced through what is termed global policy networks. There's long stretches of delegation, but networks themselves have a large number of problems. As well as offering opportunities for mobilization and support, networks have a danger and are prone to having cognitive homogeneity or groupthink. Often what this ends up happening, or what happens in this, is an exclusion of actors whose preferences and priorities do not coincide with the mainstream ideas of the network at particular times of their actions. Networks themselves are very prone to elitism and to take over by more powerful members. Sometimes this is used as network leveraging, where networks that exist are used in the interests of somebody or groups of people in particular, and maybe going against their own interests at times. It's also difficult to enforce public institution oversight onto a network, whether positive or negative, because they stretch across countries. As I mentioned several times, networks like these global level governance structures, there's a lengthy chain of delegation which makes the policy process visible only to those who are familiar with it, or particularly those who have the resources to engage. And this tends to limit the participation further away from the point of the decision making, unless concerted steps are taken to promote active participation. And for the most part, that is not done. I gave the example of the community system strengthening framework, which is one example. It itself has a lot of problems, but there was a lot of concerted effort made to try and get as many people involved in the design of this framework as possible. It leaves an accountability dilemma for NGOs and for other civil society organizations, in that networks of different actors have a diverse membership. They must satisfy multiple stakeholders with different preferences internally and externally to that network. So I hope that gives some of the conceptual issues grounded in the examples of the Global Fund that I gave. And I think what Annie is going to show you now, you start to see another level of issues starting to arise at a country level as well.